There are really two answers to that, and but they're a little bit tangential, so I can't directly answer the question. The way I'm going to first answer it is really, why did ontological design be created? And that's a political question. Insofar as what ontological design does is to recognise the insufficiency of design practice to take account of what design does. And that's going to be something which is going to make a bit more sense as we go on. So, ontological design is a political practice of design. Second part of the answer is really to put ontological design into the context of where it comes from philosophically, which means that you have to understand the relation between the ontic, the ontological, and ontology. So let me just deal with those things quite briefly. So the ontic is, in a sense, the name for everything that exists, all that exists in being, both animate and inanimate. Ontology is, in a sense, the study of something in being. And the ontological is the way that something in being actually is, the being of something in being. So that's kind of just framing it very, very schematically, philosophically. But it isn't something which is philosophically neutral. There isn't a consensus of what I've just said across philosophy. And the reason for that is that there is a kind of a debate between metaphysics and ontology. And the reason for that is, as soon as you start to produce knowledge, as soon as ontological becomes an object of intellectual, philosophical inquiry, then it becomes able to be claimed as metaphysics. So for example, there's a kind of a debate that is really between readers of Heidegger and Emmanuel Levinas, where Emmanuel Levinas essentially designates Heidegger's understanding of ontology as metaphysical, for the reason that I've just indicated, because it is, in a sense, linked to an epistemological basis of a particular metaphysics. And then the other dimension, the other kind of complexity, comes as soon as there is an experiential relation to what is encountered ontologically, which brings phenomenology into the picture, and then the interpretation of what is phenomenologically encountered, which is essentially the experience of the encounter with something in being. But that experiential encounter has to be interpreted, so that then brings the hermeneutic into position. So there's this kind of lineage, from the ontological to the phenomenological to the interpretive. So, in a sense, that's a simplification of something that sounds rather complicated, because it is far more complicated than that simplification. So, metaphysics is essentially, or the focus of metaphysics is knowledge, and the mode by which knowledge is constituted at a fundamental epistemological level. Now, the disclosure that the nature of being, which is a kind of the essence of the disclosure of ontology, is obviously something that generates or is perceived as knowledge. So inevitably there is this ambiguity in terms of the claim of whether ontological knowledge precedes or is after metaphysical knowledge. So that is something that you can't make a dispassionate objective judgment on, because it is entirely based upon the metaphysical or the ontological position that you adopt to construct your argument. The question of what design does, I'm just using, for example, Heidegger's understanding of the thing. So what essentially Heidegger does when he talks about the thing is to kind of recognize it as something that is animatory. It, in a sense, has a life. It acts performatively. So ontological design, is recognizing the performity of design as a designing performatively, which is quite different from the operational function of something which is designed. So again, it's the opposition between function and performance. So ontological design is something which exists at a kind of a larger scale and a greater complexity. It is really a way of understanding how things in the world and beings in the world interact. Well, it's important for the reason I stated at the beginning in terms of the political and design, and the adequacy of understanding design, practically and philosophically. Because what ontological design does is to ask the question, what does design do? Rather than what you need to be able to know, to be able to design, or how do you appreciate design. In a sense, it recognizes the agency of design. So the answer begins with how we understand world. So world is plural and differential. In other words, we all live on the same planet, but we all don't live in the same world. Because world, to a very large extent, is something which we culturally construct through regimes of significance and meaning, where various things across different cultures are perceived in different ways with different meaning. So those differences constitute the differences of worlds. So we are born into a particular world, which is to say that we are born into a particular culture, and that objects have a presence in that world, and the functioning of those objects in that world are, from the ontological design perspective, are understood ontologically. So let me just kind of take you through the kind of the process of, as it were, coming into and going out of the world. So in being born into the world, we're born into a world of things, and we encounter those things unknowingly as a part of our entry into the world. So we come out of a human body and immediately into a world of things, including technological things. So that is the environment that we arrive in. So we simultaneously arrive in a natural and an artificial environment, and the interaction between the two. And then as we, in a sense, become an entity in that world, as we transition from purely being biological life to being animality, to be starting to be constructed as a kind of a cultural entity, a human being, the things that we are inducted into become indivisible from that process. So, the eating of food, the wearing of clothes, the acquisition of language are all part of the world that we're in, transforming the world that we start to occupy. So that interaction with things is inseparable from the becoming of our being. So we can understand those things, in a sense, as designing. So we are, in many respects, designed by all the things that constitute the world in which we come to be within. Which is why the notion of a reductive understanding of ontological design simply being something that you can use to design beings is ridiculous, because design doesn't function in that kind of singular directive way. It is an environment. It is an event of the world. So as we progress, we kind of move from being a kind of a passive agent of design to becoming a user of design, where the things that we actually use start to more actively design us. So we start to be able to use a spoon, and the grasping of the spoon starts to educate a kind of a practice of eating, which starts to develop, but it also develops in relation to the use of the hand. We start to use an instrument to make marks with. So all of these things incrementally constitute our everyday practices, and we acquire them differentially across cultures. We don't all learn to use things in exactly the same way. So differences between us, within our culture and between our cultures, start to arrive through ontological encountered differences with things. So as we progress, a kind of cognition kind of enters into the picture. So we start to make decisions and choices about how we use things. And we start to make, in a sense, design decisions. And from a very early age, so a small child, will want to wear a particular item of clothing, will want to play with a particular toy. So that's where the anthropological dimension of design, as it is constituted ontologically, start to come into play, and where we start to organisationally start to use design, and we start then to more actively constitute the world in which we function, the world of our being. And that's, very graphically evident by the way, for example, a child, will organise the things in their bedroom. So designing as a practice ontologically arrives a long time before the idea of design ever arrives in somebody's mind. But it's been, cognitively mobilised as of an informed practice. So at some point, everybody is having a design impact on their immediate environment. As their knowledge and skills develop, their relation to design becomes more sophisticated, but equally, as their life becomes more sophisticated, the agency of design upon them starts to be more complex, so they both become more active agents of design, greater recipients of the ontological agency of design. And then, obviously, a number of people, either overtly or less so, start to use design as a specific activity that they want to develop. And that form of development, maybe under the aegis of the name design, but it can arrive in many other practices where design is more integrated in that practice. So somebody who is an electrical engineer, that's their primary focus, but in that practice that they will be making design decisions and taking design acts. So as we develop, as those specialisms develop, so the impact of design in practice on the world increases. And that's been massively amplified over millennia by the complexity of the world that we've created. So we make the world in many respects that designs us. Hence, all the things that we create, that we design, go on designing. And that designing both travels out into the world and travels in towards us. So the world that we constitute through our lives, in its transformative dimension, means that every time somebody is born, they constitute a contribution to the transformation of the world, so they die in a different world than the world in which they were born into. So it's a completely spiraling process. So it's not just circular, but it's incrementally enlarging the circle over time, or enlarging the circling over time. But then, because of the existence of many different worlds, these circles interface with each other, overlap, and that again is a transforming process. So intercultural interaction is equally inter-ontological interaction. Well, in a sense, you can say that design is this predominantly as an absence of knowledge. So all sorts of other epistemologies, all sorts of other actions, all sorts of other disciplines, all sorts of other practices, and have a relation to design. But the status of design has never been kind of elevated, has never been kind of recognised as equivalent to other fundamental areas of knowledge, the arts, humanities, the sciences. So design might get put in any one of them in a particular way, in a very subordinate relation. So, in a way, the actual agency of design, doesn't get recognised, and ontological design is, a step towards trying to gain that recognition, trying to demonstrate the importance, the significance of design. But because of the divisions of knowledge, because of the entrenchment of disciplines, there is a resistance to that recognition. Unfortunately, design theory and design practice itself has not yet discovered, really, the significance of design. So, the scale of advocacy for the recognition of design is still inadequate. I'd just like to clarify an important way to qualify how we approach ontological design. It really needs to be understood, on the one hand, as something that is phenomenally present for us in the world in which we exist. So, ontological design, phenomenologically, as I've been talking about, is how design brings our world into existence and relates to our relation to that world. But on the other hand, becoming conscious of ontological design then makes it available as something to both inquire about and to develop as a practice. So there's a difference then between the existential condition of ontological design and ontological design as something which is brought into a practice to engage the world, both in terms of understanding and action. Now, that needs one other qualification, that action can be positive or negative, just as the impact of ontological design upon us can be positive or negative. So, in terms of other things that we've talked about, for example, if you get sent to prison, that's going to have an enormous ontological consequence in relation to your way of being, and it's very likely that ontological design experience will be negative rather than positive. It will design you how you don't need to be, rather than design you in the way that actually would improve your way of being in the world.